All right, well, say good morning. Let us begin a good chodesh, everyone. Begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors, for the last day of Sivan. Naftoli and Chava Tilson, thanking Naftoli's Chaver Benjamin Wohl for introducing him to the Daf. May Hashem bless us all to finish the Daf Yomi cycle together and celebrate with a siyum together in Eretz Yisrael, Bekarov. To thank Baruch Meir and Rena Dubin. May Hashem continue to protect our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael, and may all of our children remain safe and complete their year of learning with a deep connection to the land and to Hashem's Torah. To thank our Daf Yomi sponsor, Mel Ram, Li'ilui Nishmas, his grandmother, Fega Reza Bas Moshe Ber. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. And well, with that, let us begin. Today's daf is daf Samech 60, and we are picking up on the top of Samech. So remember again, just to reorient ourselves. Thank you. A little better? Excellent. Just to reorient ourselves a little bit, we started yesterday the sugya on Nun Tesama Beis on 59b regarding the idea as follows. The Mishnah said that when they would pour the blood down the yesod, down the cavity at the base of the mizbeach, it would go down into Nachal Kidron, into the Kidron Valley. The farmers would go ahead and purchase it from the Beis Hamikdash and use it for fertilizer. Now, why did the farmers have to purchase it as opposed to just taking it? Because it was subject to Me'ilah. The Gemara introduced the idea that it's only subject to Me'ilah Midirabanan, because Mida'araisa, blood is not subject to Me'ilah. To which the sacrificial blood, to which the Gemara says, well, where do you know that from? So the Gemara quoted 3 psukim, Lachem, Lechaper, and Hu. Good. So I'll say, so ultimately the Gemara said, and furthermore, the last part of the last drasha was that essentially blood lifnei kapara is just like blood li'achar kapara. Meaning what? Just like blood li'achar kapara ultimately again is not subject to Me'ilah, right? So too blood lifnei kapara is also not subject to Me'ilah. The Gemara, why don't you just say just the opposite? Why don't you just say just like blood lifnei kapara before atonement is subject to Me'ilah, so too blood after atonement is subject to Me'ilah, to which the Gemara says there is no such thing as something which was used for its intended sacred purpose and is still subject to Me'ilah. To which the Gemara said, really? Is that true? So the Gemara points out Trumas Hadeshan. Right? Trumas Hadeshan, the ash, the avoda has already been done. Obviously, the sacrificial parts are burned, yet the ash itself is still subject to Me'ilah. To which the Gemara said, we'll say top of Samich. First lines just start from here. Mishum dahavi trumas hadeshin ubig dekuna shnei ksuvin habayin ke'echad. V'chol shnei ksuvin habayin ke'echad ein melamdin. Because we'll say trumas hadeshin and blood are what we call, trumas hadeshin and big day kuna, Trumas hadeshin and big day kuna are shnei ksuvin habayin ke'echad. And I will say now, which big day kuna are we referring to over here? We mentioned this in yesterday's daf. The big day kahuna the Kohen wore on Yom Kippur. So the Torah says that after the Kohen does the avodah v'nicham sham, Rashi quotes over here, he shall leave the clothing there, which indicates, the Gemara explains, that halacha l'maisa, the clothing, the big day lavan of the Kohen are subject to Me'ilah even after the avodah of Yom Kippur. So I will say, so therefore you have two examples of sacred items which even after they're used for their intended purpose are still subject to Me'ilah. What are the two things? Trumas Hadeshin and Dam. Trumas Hadeshin and Big Day Kahuna. And I will say, the principle is, whenever the Torah says something once, what does that become? A rule. And whenever it says it twice, what does it become? An exception. So that's what we call shnei ksuvin habayin ke'echad. Whenever the Torah states the same thing twice, ein melamdin. Again, what's stated applies to the particular things in question, but it does not create a general overarching rule. To which the Gemara says, hani chal rabbanan. So we'll say, now let's zero in over here for a moment on Big Day Kahuna. So this makes sense according to the Rabbanan who say, Da'amri, v'nicham sham, melamit shetu'unin gniza. Now we'll say this makes sense according to the Rabbanan who say that the phrase v'hinicham sham by the big day lavan of the Kohen Gadol of Yom Kippur means tu'unin gniza, that even after the Kohen Gadol does the avodah, his clothing must be actively stored away, which indicates that they're still subject to Me'ilah. El Rabidosa, the Amr Big Day Kuhuna Ru'uyin Hein Lakoin Hedyot, my Ikalameimar. But according to Rabidosa, who holds that what that Allah Lamaisa, it's supposed to remember again. Interestingly enough, the Big Day Kahuna of the Kohen Gadol of Yom Kippur are just almost exactly like the regular the clothing of a Kohen Hedyot during the rest of the year. So Rabbi Dosa holds that after Yom Kippur is over, a Kohen Hedyot could then use the clothing of the Kohen Gadol for regular service. So what do you see from there? You see, according to Rabbi Dosa, the clothing of the Kohen Gadol is not subject to Me'ilah after Yom Kippur. We'll say if that's the case, then what? Then I'm left only with what? Shumas Hadeshen. Shumas Hadeshen, therefore, is one example, one situation where even after the sacrificial service is done, the object is still subject to Me'ilah. Well, if there's only one, then one could what? Create a rule. In which case, perhaps we should say that even after something has been used for its intended sacred purpose, it can still be subject to Me'ilah. To which the Gemara says, Mishum da Shumas Hadeshen ve'egla arufa shnei ksuven habayin ke'achad. Because in reality, according to Rabbi Dosa, essentially it's going to come down to is like this. Everyone is going to agree that there are two examples of items which were used for their intended sacred purpose, but yet are still subject to Me'ilah. In which case, as long as you have two, you could apply the principle of Shnei Ksuven Habayin Ke'echad Ein Malamdin. What's the machlokes? The machlokes is, which two? Which two? So according to the first approach, the two are Shumas Hadeshen and Big Day Kahuna. And the fact that in those two cases, the Torah says even after the intended service is done, the item is still subject to Me'ilah, you're not allowed to use it for mundane purposes. Again, that's two examples. Anytime the Torah says something twice, Ein Malamdin, you can't create a rule. That's just circumstances that apply to those two unique situations. Rabbi Dosa says the two examples are Shumas Hadeshen and Egla Arufa. We'll say, namely, what do you mean Egla Arufa? We know this, right? We know the episode of Egla Arufa. He found someone murdered in between two cities. The individuals, the elders of the closest city come out. They decapitate a calf in a dried up riverbed. They go ahead and they wash their hands over the decapitated calf. They say, Adeno lo shavchu dam zeh. The idea is that even after the calf has been decapitated and the service is done, the calf is subject to Me'ilah. According to Rabbi Dosa, the two examples are Shumas Hadeshen and Egla Arufa, and Halacha Lamaisa once again will apply the concept of Shnei Ksuven Habayin Ke'echad Ein Malamdin. Whenever the Torah states something twice, it's coming to teach you not to create a rule that applies to everything else, but rather just to apply to these two unique circumstances. So the Gemara says, first of all, Hani Chalaman Damar Ein Malamdin. So we'll say, watch this. So now the good news is, where we're up to right now is that everyone is agreeing that we have two examples of objects which are subject to Me'ilah even after their intended use, which is beautiful. Why is that beautiful? Because Shnei Ksuven Habayin Ke'echad Ein Malamdin, and therefore again there's no rule, just two exceptions to the rule. That's fine according to the approach that says Hani Chalman Da'amar Shnei Ksuven Habayin Ke'echad Ein Malamdin. However, Elaman Damar Malamdin Ma'ikal Meimar. So I will say, see, here's the issue. The issue is not everyone agrees with that principle, right? All this whole discussion works fine according to the opinion that says Shnei Ksuven Habayin Ke'echad Ein Malamdin, but there is another opinion, and that other opinion says Shnei Ksuven Habayin Ke'echad Malamdin, that you can go ahead and learn out a rule from something that is stated twice. So we'll say if that's the case, what do I do with all the in others? First of all, that poses a problem in terms of dam, right? Because of dam, then it really could be that perhaps if you're going to compare lifnei kapara to achar kapara, but the Gemara says, Michael Meimar, tre me'ute ksivi. So I will say it's different over here because there are two mi'utim. There are two exclusionary phrases, visamo and ha'arufa. So I will say, again, interestingly enough, even if you hold Shnei Ksuven Habayin Ke'echad Malamdin, the Torah uses certain exclusionary words by Shumas Hadeshen and by Egla Arufa to teach you that the Me'ilah status that applies to these items, even after their service is done, is uniquely related to these two items. So it's uniquely related, ultimately, again, to Trumas Hadeshen and to Para Aduma, and therefore cannot be used to learn out anything else from it. So I'll say, interestingly enough, what kind of comes out from this conversation is that halacha l'maisa, as a rule, we are going to say, when does the prohibition of me'ilah stop? At what point? As a general rule, when the avodah is done. As soon as the intended sacrificial purpose has been served, the prohibition of me'ilah is no longer there. What we begin to see is that there are two exceptions to that rule, right? The two, possibly three, right? But the two that it appears everybody's going to agree with is, well, I shouldn't say this, machlokes, which two? Either it's Trumas Hadeshen Egla Arufa, or it's Trumas Hadeshen and Big Day Kahuna of Yom Kippur. So right, everybody's going on Trumas Hadeshen. It's the other one. And I will say, so again, and even if you hold Shnei Ksuvin Abayin Ke'echad Malamdin, in other words, even if you subscribe to the idea, the Torah says that you can learn a rule, the Torah goes out of its way to make Trumas Hadeshen and Egla Arufa an exclusion by using exclusionary or limiting wording to indicate that the Me'ilah status that applies post-avoda is unique to these two situations and doesn't apply to anything else. Incredible. So we'll say, the Gemara loops back for just a moment. Bahani tlasi kroi b'dam lamali. So we'll say, so remember again, going back for just a moment, when we began this discussion regarding blood, so the Gemara quoted 3 psukim. Remember, everyone was agreeing that mid'araisa, dam is not subject to Me'ilah. Right? Midrabanan, the rabbis made it subject to Me'ilah. So why do I need 3 psukim to drive home this idea that blood is not subject to Me'ilah? Meaning, the Gemara says, "Vani tatzkrei b'dam lamali, chal mi'ute minosar, v'chal mi'ute mi'Me'ilah, v'chal mi'ute mituma." So what says is very interesting, because what the 3 psukim do is, in addition to saying that blood is not subject to Me'ilah, mid'araisa, the Torah also tells me the following. Blood is not subject to the prohibition of nosar. Let's remember again, what's nosar? Anytime you leave a carbon over past its permitted time, it becomes nosar. So for example, Rabbi said, let's say you have a carbon, and you left the carbon over, 48 hours, and now you're eating the blood of that carbon. So what's the halacha? Now you're chayiv. What are you chayiv for? Eating blood. You're not allowed to eat blood, right? So you're chayiv for eating blood, but you wouldn't be chayiv twice for eating blood and nosar. So the extra phrase, one pasuk comes to tell me that not only is blood included from Me'ilah, but blood is also excluded from the prohibition of nosar. So if you were to eat blood which is nosar, you would only be chayiv once. Furthermore, one pasuk comes to exclude the prohibition of Me'ilah, as we've been speaking about. And a third pasuk comes to exclude from the prohibition of tumah, which means what? Tzeva say, if you were to go ahead and eat sacrificial blood in a state of tumah. So thinking about this, how many times should you be chayiv? How many chiyuvim should there be? 2. Number 1 for consumption of blood. Number 2 for consuming something sacred in a state of ritual impurity. Kamash malan. Another pasuk comes on to teach me I'm chayiv for blood consumption, but I'm not chayiv for consuming something sacrificial in a state of tumah. Avami pigul lo tzarich mu'utekra. Now I said, interestingly enough, you're also not chayiv, right? Let's say you eat blood that is pigul. So remember again, what's the case of pigul? So pigul is an interesting psul, because what pigul is that halacha l'maisa, if the kohen's doing the avoda and he goes ahead and has an erroneous machshava. Let's say a particular carbon that can only be consumed for 24 hours, and the kohen goes ahead and eats it 48 hours later, right? He has intention to eat it at 48 hours. So what's the halacha? So the halacha is that the carbon is invalidated. It's an interesting psul. So the Gemara says that blood is not subject to pigul. So again, I have 3 psukim, and they come to exclude, number 1, let's go in the order of our sugya. Number 1, to exclude blood from the prohibition of Me'ilah. Number 2, to exclude blood from the prohibition of nosar. And number 3, to exclude blood from the prohibition of tumah. Blood is also excluded from the prohibition of pigul. But interesting enough, the Gemara says, I don't need a pasuk to teach me that. Why not, says the Gemara. So the Gemara says, Disnan, kol sheyesh lo matirin, bein la adam, bein la mizbeach, chayav and alav mishum pigul. supposed to listen to this. We actually learned this sugya, that the only item that is subject to the prohibition of pigul is something that has what's called a matir, something that has built into it a part of its service, which by definition is the permitter, right? Is the item which allows the item to be, is the action or the avoda which allows the item to become permitted. Permitted, it doesn't matter to who. Permitted could be permitted to Hashem, which means allows it to be offered up on the Mizbeach. Permitted for people, allows it permitted for consumption. So that in order to be subject to pigul, you must have a matir. You must have some type of service that permits you to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to go on the Mizbeach, or permits you for consumption by people. So why doesn't pigul apply to blood? Because the Gemara says, dam atzmo matir. But just to illustrate this, interestingly enough, in general circumstances, sacrificial circumstances, what is the permitter? What is the matir? What is the matir? It's the dam. Because think about this, Rabosai. It is the zrikas hadam that allows for the offering up of a carbon on the Mizbeach. It's the zrikas hadam that ultimately allows for consumption of carbonos which are consumed. So blood itself is the matir for most things, for almost all things. Therefore, interestingly enough, blood itself, which is the matir, but blood doesn't have a matir, so to speak. Right? Blood doesn't have a permitter. There's nothing that makes the blood permitted, because blood itself is the matir. Therefore, just on a technical level, it is not subject to me'ilah. Good. I will say that brings to a close this sugya. Just before we run to the next Mishnah, I sent out last night the Rambam, so you could see it. You could see it on the chat. We're not going to do this whole Rambam, although I would urge you to take a look at it because it really is quite fascinating. But just to close out the sugyas, because remember this last Mishnah went ahead and spoke about the avoda. Parak Dalid Halacha Beis spoke about the avoda of the blood applications by the inner mizbeach. So what I just wanted to point out to you was as follows. Remember again, we had a machlokes as to which direction the Kohen Gadol was going to go in. So remember, if you just take a quick look at the Rambam I sent you, again, we're literally going to spend 1 minute on this. So if you take a look, I don't think I marked it off where we're starting off, but it's kind of right in the middle. If you look, va'omeid lifnim mizbeach hazav. Do you see it? It's like point in the middle of the Rambam. This is Parak Dalet Halacha Beis. Va'omeid lifnim mizbeach hazav mizbeach hamenoros. Remember again, the Kohen Gadol, after he finishes the blood applications on the kaporas, just so we finish out the halacha lamais on the sugya. So the Kohen Gadol stands in between the curtain, the kaporas, ultimately again, and the golden mizbeach. And he's standing really between the Mizbeach and the Menorah. Umascha lahazos b'damat haravis akanos Mizbeach hazav. V'hu misavev v'holech umaz al akanos mizbeach. So we'll say Salach l'maisa number 1. Remember again we had a machlokas about hakafa biyad or hakafa beregel. Does the Kohen Gadol stand in place and do the blood applications, or does he walk around? Rambam Paskins halacha l'maisa hakafa beregel. He walks around. That's point number 1. What was the other point? What was the other machlokas? Basically, and Rabbi Akiva. Which direction do you begin from? Umaschil mikeren mizrachis tzefonis. And where do you begin from? I will say from the northeast corner. So again, just to illustrate, if you remember again on the pictures that were sent out the other day, this was picture 141. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Haglili. You start from the northeast corner and make your way around counterclockwise. So the Gemara says as follows: Umaschel mikar mizrachis tzfonis litzfonis ma'aravis. Right, you then go again to northwest, lema'aravis dromis, southwest, ledromis mizrachis, southeast. Va'al kulon hu nosei milamata l'malon. And for all the applications, you go again from below to above. Chutz min ha'achrona, with the exception of the last one, shunosein milamalon lematon. Except for the last application, which you do from the top to the bottom, kadesh lo yislach lechu kelov, in order that his clothing does not become soiled. So we'll say so hakafa beregel. He's walking around. Rabbi Yossi Haglili, you're going to start ultimately from Mizrachis Tzefonis, northeast corner, and walk around. And we'll say last piece. Then remember again, after you do the blood applications on the corners, what's next? Sprinkling on the top of the Mizbeach. What do? Push the coals, separate out the coals, make an open area on the top of the Mizbeach. umazed dam hataroves al tiro shel mizbeach sheva pamim bitzad hadarum b'makom sheshamu matnos karnosav. And what do? You go ahead and you do the blood application on the actual top of the mizbeach. Where? On the southern side. Why on the southern side? Because you do the blood applications on the top of the mizbeach where you ended the applications on the corners. And since you finished the corners ultimately again on the southern side, therefore halacha l'maisa, you do that blood application on the southern side as well. Good. V'yotze b'shofech shiur adam ha'yisum ha'rosh ha'chitzon. Then you take whatever blood is left over, you walk out. Kohen Gadol walks out of the Beis HaMikdash, goes over to the western yisod, the western base of the Mizbeach, and pours out the blood remnants there. So I will say, we'll stop over here in the Rambam, because then we'll go on with the Avodah, but that's the halacha l'maisa. Kafa beregel walks around, begins with the Tzfonis Ma'aravis, the northeast corner, makes his way around, does blood applications from bottom to top, except the exception of the last one, does 7 blood applications on, or 7 sprinklings on the top of the Mizbeach on the southern side. Beautiful. We'll say, let's go weiter. Mishnah. So we'll say in general, whenever we speak about the Avodah of Yom Kippur, so remember again, there's a particular order. There's an order. Im hiktim ma'aseh lechaver la'asa klum. We'll say if you violate the order and you do one thing before the other, so the Avodah is invalid. Which again, when we say invalid, what does it mean? You have to do it again. You have to do it again. So the order is important. So for example, hiktim dam hasar ledam apar. So for example, I will say we spent a lot of time on this, that ultimately again you have to go ahead and shech the par before the sayer and do the blood avoda of the par before the sayer. But if you went ahead and you switched the order, you did the dam hasar before dam apar, yachzor v'yazeh midam hasayer la'achar dam hapar. So we've seen this already before. So halacha l'maisa, you're supposed to sprinkle the blood of the par before the blood of the sayer. If you messed up the order and you did the sayer before the par, you have to go ahead and sprinkle again, starting with the par and then the sayer. Well, so what about the following situation? Let's say the Kohen Gadol is doing the avoda inside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. For example, right? He's going ahead and doing the sprinkling. And we'll say what happens? He goes ahead and some of the blood spills, or not some of the blood. He drops the bowl. And all of the blood spills out. Yavi dam acher v'yachzer b'tchila mibifnim. So we'll say, what's the halacha? He shechts another animal, and he has to start that blood service again. Meaning, what does this mean? Let's say, for example, the Kohen Gadol is in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and he drops the bowl of blood, the dam hapar. So now, let's say he was 2 sprinkles in, two hazaos in. So now he drops the bowl, the blood spills. He has no more blood. What does he have to do? Go shecht another par, get the dam, bring the dam back in. You might have thought, well, he's already done 2. He only has 5 more, or really, technically 6 more altogether. No, halacha l'maisa, the sprinklings are a unit. So therefore, again, once you go ahead and you disrupt the flow of the sprinklings, you have to start from the beginning. Yavi dam acher, v'yachzer mitchilam mibifnim, v'chein beheichol, v'chein mizbeach hazav, shekulan kapara bifnei asman. I both say the acts of sprinkling are all considered to be one unit. They're all one unit. So because they are all one unit, therefore, Allah Chalamaysa, for some reason, it is interrupted, you have to start from the beginning. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon, Omrim, Mimakom Shepasak, Mishama Masla. Suppose that we're going to see this is subject of debate. So you have Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon saying that Allah Chalamaysa, no, they're not one unit. In other words, if let's say again, you started the sprinkling, then the blood spilled. Let's say you were 2 sprinklings in. So the Tanakama says it's one unit. And if you have to start, if you need new blood, you have to start all of the acts of sprinkling again. Rabbi Elazar and Shimon say, no, halacha l'maisa, what's done is done, and just pick up where you left off with the new batch of blood. Good, we'll see what the nature of the machlokes says in the Gemara. So we'll say, it's a Tanah Abanam. So we'll say, here we go. So really what we're going to focus on now is the first part of the Mishnah, which is that the Seder of the Avodah of Yom Kippur is ma'akev. Right, is an indispensable part of the kashrus of the avodah. So if you go ahead and you mess up the seder, you mess up the order, halacha l'maisa, halacha l'maisa, you have to go ahead and do the avoda again. So Tan Rabbanon, kol ma'asim kippurim amar ala seder, im hikdim ma'isa lechavero lo asa klum. So the Brisa says as follows: any as we saw in the Mishnah, any part of the seder avoda of Yom Kippur, if you go ahead and put something before its fellow, right, you disrupt the order. Your actions are meaningless. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Emasai. When is this so? In other words, we'll say, remember, there's a lot of parts to the avoda on Yom Kippur. So to what does this statement apply? Emasai. Bidvarim hana'asin bebigdei lavan mibifnim. This only applies to parts of the avoda that are done in white clothing in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So it's only the avoda in the Kodesh HaKadoshim that the seder is ma'akev. And if you disrupt the biblically prescribed order, you must go ahead and do the avoda again. Avol dvarim hanasim bebigdei lavan mibachutz. But items, parts of the avoda that you do in white clothing outside, I will say outside just means outside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, im hiktim ma'aseh lechavero masha asui asui. If you went ahead and you disrupted the order, what is done is done. Now we'll say, what are some examples? Now we know what's done inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim. We know the sprinkling of the damapar, the sprinkling of the damasa'ir, and kitoras. What's done outside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim in Big Day Lavan? So take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, Big Day Lavan mi bachotz kigon hagrala, the drawing of the lots for the sair laHashem and the sir laAzazel. Vidui, confession. Shvichos shirayim, spilling out of the remaining blood. V'chol matnos haparochas, blood applications on the curtain. Mizbach hazav, blood applications on the incense mizbeach. Im hiktim lohen davar me'uchar ein elu ma'akvin alav leposlo aval b'shchita b'chafina modu l'safar. So both says, listen to this. So Rabbi Yehuda's shita is like this. The only thing that is ma'akev is avoda that you do in Big Day Lavan, white clothing inside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. But anything done with white clothing outside, ultimately again is not ma'akev. And I will say, it seems to go without saying that what? Anything you do with Big Day Zav, because remember again, the Kohen doesn't wear white clothing the whole day. We saw this earlier. Anything you do with Big Day Zav, certainly disruption of the order is not ma'akev. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Nechemiah, or Rabbi Nechemiah says, when is the order ma'akev? Right? When is the order an indispensable part of the avoda? B'dvarim hanasim b'Big Day Lavan, bein mi bifnim, bein mi bachutz. Aval b'dvarim hanasim b'Big Day Zav, mi bachutz, Masha asa asui. Rabbi Nechemiah disagrees. Rabbi Nechemiah says any part of the avoda that the Kohen does big day lavan, by definition is ma'akev. Whether or not, again, when I say ma'akev, right, meaning the order is ma'akev. So anything you do big day lavan, whether you do it again inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim, inside the Kodesh, wherever you're doing big day lavan, ultimately that order is ma'akev, is an indispensable necessity for the kashrus of the avoda. But anything you do big day zav, anything the Kohen does in gold clothing, and I will say, remember again, what's the examples of big day zav? Look at Rashi. The big day zav mibachotz kigon elo ve'elaam, right? The Kohen offering up his ram, the ram of the people. Shehiktim lohen otzaz kafel machta in ma'akvin alav lifsal. So we'll say this is the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemiah in the Mishnah. Now, interestingly enough, when you read the Mishnah, you assume that the Mishnah statement applies to everything, right? That everything has to be done in its prescribed order, and if it's not, ultimately, again, it is ma'akev. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nechemiah, to define the scope a little bit. Rabbi Yehuda telling us the only time that the order is ma'akev is ultimately, again, Big Day Lavan in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Rabbi Nechemiah, Big Day Lavan inside, anywhere, right? Inside Kodesh HaKadoshim, outside Kodesh HaKadoshim. But anything done by Big Day Zav, the order is not ma'akev. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ushnehem mikra echad darshu. Interestingly enough, both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemiah darshan the same pasuk. What's the pasuk? V'haisa zos lachem l'chukas olam achos bashana. So the Torah says this will be for you an everlasting statute, achas bashana, one time a year. Look at Rashi before you turn the page. Achas bashana, alma kiksib chuka. Leikuva achas b'shana ksiv. So we'll say what the Torah is saying over here is the chukas olam, right? This chok of Yom Kippur is ma'akev. Achaz b'shana is an ikuv, is ma'akev. It must be done in a particular way. Amar Beis. So how do they each darshan it? Rabbi Huda savar makom shem miskabrim bo achaz b'shana. So Rabbi Huda says, what's ma'akev? What's ma'akev is the place that you enter into once a year. The achaz b'shana refers to the place you enter into once a year. What's the place you enter into once a year? Kodesh Kadashim, to teach me that it's only the avoda that is done in the Kodesh HaKadashim, which by definition can only be done with big day love and white clothing. Only the order of that avoda is ma'akev. But if you mess up the order anywhere else, it's not good. We're going to try to avoid it. But lamaisa, it's not ma'akev. Rabbi Nechemia savar dvarim hamiskaprim bahen achos bashana. Rabbi Nechemia says no. It refers to the avoda through which you achieve kapara, which is done with white clothing once a year. So both say, so what's interestingly enough is Rabbi Yehuda holds Achaz Bashana essentially refers to the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Rabbi Nechemia holds that Achaz Bashana essentially refers to the Big Day Lavan. So that's the machlokes, right? Rabbi Yehuda will say it's only the avoda that you do in the place where you enter into once a year. That order is ma'akev. Therefore, he will say only avoda done the big day lava in the Kodesh Kadashim, the order is ma'akev. Rabbi Nechemia will say only the avoda that you do for kapara once a year, which is avoda that is done the big day lavan, that avoda is ma'akev. Whether that avoda is done in the Kodesh HaKadashim or outside the Kodesh HaKadashim, if it's done the big day lavan, ultimately the order is ma'akev. Atu, Rabbi Huda makom ksiv. So here's the problem. Does the pasuk say the place where the kohen, the makom where the kohen is achaz bashana? In other words, achaz bashana is a calendrical reality. It's not a geographic reality. So how does Rabbi Huda darshan achaz bashana ultimately again to refer to the makom? Elahainu tamid Rabbi Huda. You're right. So Rabbi Huda learns out his svar from a different place. Elahainu tamid Rabbi Huda. Ksiv zos uksiv achos. It says zos. It says right. It says the word zos. Rashi says mashma chuka al zos ksiva v'lo al acheres. Uksiv achas, and it says one. So the Gemara says chad lemiute big day lavan mibachutz, vechad lemiute big day zahav. One also will say, interestingly enough, now the drush is going to change around a little bit, and Rabbi Yehuda is going to darshan two exclusionary words, and the two exclusionary words is one to exclude big day lavan mibachutz, that whatever avoda you do wearing white clothing outside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the order is not ma'akev, and one is to exclude any avoda you do with big day zav, the order of that avoda is not ma'akev as well. Fine, Rabbi Nechemia, chad lemiute big day zav, vechad lemiute shirayim delo ma'akvi. Rabbi Nechemia, on the other hand, will go ahead and use the two exclusionary words to teach me something else. One, to go ahead and exclude big day zahav, right? That any avoda done with gold clothing, by definition, the order is not ma'akev. So we'll say this is now going to interesting discussion. I mean, the Nechemia holds that if you failed to pour out the shirayim, it's not ma'akev. Now let's take a step back because this goes back to the Rambam we just saw. After you finish with all of the blood, the damapar and the damasoyer, what do you do? Remember, at this point in time, by the time you get to the golden mizbeach, the inner mizbeach, it's all mixed together. What do you do with the leftover blood? What do you do with it? Spill it out. Where do you pour it out? Right. You're going to pour it out by the yesod of the mizbeach, by the yesod. So we'll say. So now, interestingly, Rabbi Nechemia holds that the pouring out of the shirayim is not ma'akev. Interestingly enough, so for some reason, if you fail to pour out the remnants of the blood in the base of the mizbeach, it's not ma'akev. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda, ma'akvi ma'akvi, lo ma'akvi, lo ma'akvi. So we'll say, Rabbi Yehuda will say as follows. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Lemiute shirayim. Rashi says, shlichas shirayim de lo ma'akvi, davar hamo ochra lahem. Im hikdimu lahem apa pi shein na'asim b'big day lavan in tzijum ma'akev. And I will say, so the truth is, let me rephrase that a little bit, because according to Rashi, what's happening now is as follows. Rabbi Nechemia will hold that the order of the shirayim is not ma'akev. So, for example, what we would have seen normally is that halacha l'maisa, after the pouring out of the shirayim, the kohen gadol would go out to do the avoda of the seirim. Let's say he went ahead and he did something before he poured out the shirayim. Rabbi Nechemia would say that the order of the shirayim is not ma'akev. Rabbi Yehuda says, interestingly enough, ima akvi ma'akvi, ilo ma'akvi, lo ma'akvi. Now what does that mean? Look at Rashi. Rabbi Yehuda, ima akvi, shar dvar manasim b'dei lavan mibachotz, kisidron ma'akvi, afshayim kisidron. So Rabbi say, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't understand Rabbi Nechemiah's logic. Because remember, what's Rabbi Nechemiah's logic? Rabbi Nechemiah said before, what's ma'akev? Any avoda you do b'bigdei lavan. Right, white clothing, whether you do it inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim, outside the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So now remember, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't subscribe to that. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the only thing that's ma'akev is what? Avoda you do b'bigdei lavan in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Rabbi Yehuda says to Rabbi Nechemiah, your shita makes no sense. Right? Your shita makes no sense. Why not? Rabbi Nechemiah, if you hold anything done b'bigdei lavan is ma'akev, whether it's inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim or outside, then when you pour the shirayim, should be ma'akev. Because we'll say, what clothing does the Kohen Gadol wear when he pours out the shirayim? Bigdei lavan. So I don't understand. Rabbi Yehuda says, ima akvi ma'akvi, lo ma'akvi, lo ma'akvi. Rabbi Nechemiah, if you hold that avoda done by bigdei lavan is ma'akev, then the pouring of the shirayim should be ma'akev. And if you hold that the pouring of the shirayim is not ma'akev, then the truth is anything else done by bigdei lavan outside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim shouldn't be ma'akev either. To which the Gemara says, Kidisanya, as we learned, v'chila mechaper es hakodesh. Now, also, v'chila mechaper literally means when he finishes atoning for the kodesh. Im kiper, kila. Ultimately, again, if he's done the blood applications, then he's finished. V'im lo kiper, but if he has not done the blood applications, lo kila, he's not finished. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. These are the words of Rabbi Akiva. So the Gemara says, let's say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. So we're going to see for just a moment that Rabbi Yehuda holds that the pouring out of the remnants of the blood is part of the process of the blood application. It's part of the matnos damim, and therefore ultimately, again, it should be ma'akev. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda, mipnei ma lo ne'emar im kila mechaper ve'im lo kila lo mechaper. Why doesn't the Torah say, if you finish, there is kapara, and if you haven't finished, there's not kapara? To teach you, shemchiser achas mikol matanos lo asa v'lo klum. To teach us that if halacha l'maisa, anything was missing from any of the blood applications, it's as if you have done absolutely nothing. To which the Gemara says, va'aminon, and we said, my benayu, what is the practical difference between these two opinions? Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shimon Levi. Chad Amar Mashmaos Darshan Ikabenayu V'Chad Amar Shirayim Ma'akvi Ikabenayu. So both say one opinion said that halacha l'maisa the machlokus just had a darshan psukim, that's Mashmaos Ikabenayu, and the other opinion said no, whether or not Shirayim Ma'akvi, Rabbi say, is the pouring out of the leftover blood part of the blood service or not. That is a fundamental machlokas. Take a look at Rashi. Shirayim ma'akvi ikabenei. Rashi says, Rabbi Akiva savar shirayim lo ma'akvi. Rabbi Akiva also said that the pouring out of the remnants of blood is not ma'akev. He holds that's not part of the blood service, and therefore vachi kamar im kiper ikar hamatanos kila. And therefore, according to Rabbi Akiva, also again back for just a moment, when the pasuk said v'chila mechaper as hakodesh, right? When you finish the blood applications, kapara is complete. When do you finish the blood applications? As soon as the blood is applied to the mizbeach. According to Rabbi Akiva, the pouring out of the remnants is not ma'akev. Back to Rashi. Vachi kamar im kiper ikar matanos kila va'afilu lo shavach shirayim. Rabbi Akiva says you do not need the pouring out of the remnants. Rabbi Huda savar ma'akvi. But say Rabbi Huda holds that the pouring out of the shirayim, right, the pouring out of leftover blood is part of the blood service. And the blood service is not complete until when? Until the remnants are poured out. So the Gemara says, Vachi kamar, em kila hakol as kiper. It is only when the blood service is fully complete that kapara is affected. V'im lo, lo kiper. In a kapar shaman taskuna. So both say, now listen to this. So let's just loop back for just a moment. Remember, Rabbi Nechemiah wanted to go ahead and come along and say that the exception to his rule is what? His rule is what? That any avoda, remember, we'll say, what's our machlokas? What's our topic? Right, good morning, right? What's our topic, right? Our topic is we have a Mishnah. And what did the Mishnah say? What did the Mishnah say? Order is meaningful. Order is ma'akev. Great. Machlokas Rabbi Nechemiah. What is that referring to, right? Order of what? Order of what? Rabbi Yehuda says it's only the order of what? avoda done in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Now he phrases it as avoda done bebig day lavan in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Truth is a little bit repetitive. Why is it repetitive? Because you only do avoda bebig day lavan in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Okay, so according to Rabbi Yehuda, big day lavan, Kodesh HaKadoshim. According to Rabbi Nechemia, big day lavan, inside and outside. Anywhere you do avoda bebig day lavan, that the order is ma'akiv. That's our machlokes. We then pointed out that halacha l'maisa, there are a couple of exclusionary words that are brought down by the avodah. Rabbi Nechemia uses those exclusions to teach me that what? That even though the pouring out of shirayim is done by big day lavan, the order of that is not ma'akiv. So if you were to go ahead and push the pouring out of the shirayim later on, it wouldn't be a big deal. Rabbi Nechemia, let me say that. Not that it's not a big deal. It's a big deal. It's not ma'akiv. Rabbi Yehuda says, what are you talking about? Ma'akvi, lo ma'akvi. The pouring out of the shirayim is part of the blood service. It's part of the matnas, no, it's part of the blood avoda. So I don't understand. Rabbi Nechemia, be true to your word. If you hold that Allah l'maisa, avoda done by big day lavan is ma'akev, the point will say, you know what it comes down to is we often think like, what's the pouring out of shirayim? What is that? What is that? It's just properly disposing of leftovers. But l'maisa, it's not avoda. Rabbi Yehuda says it's avoda. It's avoda. So in Nechemia, if you hold that any avoda done by big day lavan is ma'akev, the order is ma'akev, then shirayim should be ma'akev. What the Gemara just did was just to prove that Rabbi Yehuda holds that the pouring out of the shirayim is avoda. That's what just happened over here. So watch this. Now the Gemara goes right to me. Did Rabbi Yochanan really say this? Now both did Rabbi Yochanan say what? If you look at Rashi, Rashi says, "The Rabbi Nechemia shirayim lo ma'akvi." Did Rabbi Yochanan really say that according to Rabbi Nechemia, the pouring out of shirayim, the order is not ma'akiv? Did he really say that? After all, the Gemara says, "Vam Rabbi Yochanan, Tan Rabbi Nechemia kedivya omer shirayim ma'akvi." Yet we also learned that what Rabbi Yochanan said that Rabbi Nechemia holds according to the opinion who says the pouring of shirayim is ma'akiv. Okay, well, so here we have a problem now, because you seem to have a contradiction in the shita of Rabbi Nechemia. Rabbi Yochanan quoted Rabbi Nechemia saying before that the pouring out of shirayim is not ma'akev, meaning the order is not ma'akev. Here we have on record that Rabbi Nechemia is saying that what? That the order of the pouring out of shirayim is ma'akev. So what's going on over here? The Gemara says, kasha. And I will say that is a question, it's a contradiction, and I will say we will stop over here. So just so you understand, we're still leaving off with the same machlokes, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nechemia, a Mishnah that teaches me that order is meaningful, order is ma'akiv, machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia, when we must be makbid with the order, and when we don't have to. Eretz Hashem to be continued, and halacha l'maisa tomorrow. Shkayach.